Yo, what is up, guys? Will here with Canyon from Fantasy Basketball, bringing you a different kind of video. We're going to be looking at some of our biggest tips for category league drafts. Category leagues, I know we talk about points leagues a lot when we're talking about players, and we mix in some category league stuff, but category league drafts are a different kind of beast from points leagues. Because for a category, while you are building a roster with guards and forwards and centers, instead of fantasy points, being the, thing you're focused on, you're looking at the individual stats that the players bring. So points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, threes, field goal percentage, and free throw percentage for 8-cat leagues, and you add in turnovers for a 9-cat leagues. Both will be applicable when we're talking about these tips here.
Yeah, so the first thing you're going to want to think of when you're doing your 9-cat, 8-cat leagues here is you want to know what kind of team you're going to build, what categories you're going to go for. Usually this is kind of established within your first 2 to 3 rounds, right? When you get your studs, these are going to be the backbones of your build, right? So if you stumble into that number one pick and you want to go with Jokic or Giannis or Luka, if you go with Jokic, maybe you're going big, heavy to dominate, points, rebounds, or even you could pivot off assists. If you want to start with Luka or Harden, some more assist-heavy guys, you're just going to start with those guys. That's going to be your backbone of what kind of categories you're going to go for, guard-heavy, big-heavy, whatever. And then you kind of decide what categories you want to punt. Now, punting is a term that's thrown around a lot in category formats, and it's kind of when you stop going for a certain category, right? You're not actively seeking out to gain a player that is good in that trait. But certain players have way more value in more categories than in the others. So punting is a very interesting strategy. Will, do you want to talk about punting more?
Yeah. I think punting, obviously when you're looking to punt certain categories, like Canyon had mentioned, it's usually based off your first couple of picks. Those are your biggest impact players from usage perspective. So if you're looking at certain guys who struggle in those categories, you punt. So later in drafts, you think to yourself, I don't care about X category, whether it's, free throw percentage. You don't care about grabbing guys who, are better free throw percentage shooters because your first couple picks who have a big impact aren't great. So you focus on other categories and try to make sure that you win those categories. You're fine losing and giving up the 1, 2, 3 categories you're punting because you're so focused on winning those other categories when ultimately all you care about is, winning the most categories in your matchup. But one thing I do want to mention for punting categories is it's an obvious strategy, but punting categories does not mean you're trying to be bad in the categories you're punting. It just means that you're ignoring and don't care about those categories. So, for example, if you're getting later in a draft and you've decided to punt free throw percentage, for example, your first pick was Giannis, and you're thinking to yourself, Giannis, not a great free throw shooter. I'm fine taking guys who aren't great free throw shooters and punting that category a little bit. That doesn't mean if you have 2 players later in a draft that you value similarly, with your team build and structure. It doesn't mean that you want to take the guy who's a worse free throw shooter, because having worse players in the categories you're punting doesn't help you at all. There's times where in a matchup, you'll win categories that you're punting because of a team that also punted those categories or just the way the week went. So you're not trying to suck at the categories you're punting. You just ignore them. Yeah. So, like I had mentioned, there are times where, you can win the categories you're punting. So, if you have players similarly valued, don't just lean towards the one you're punting. Don't have that stuck in your mind of never take guys who are good free throw shooters. I'm punting that. It's just something that you ignore and focus on the other categories.
Yeah. And to continue, my personal bias on how I like to structure these 9-cat leagues, just in case, you're new to this 9-cat, 8-cat format, 5 out of the 9 categories, so best of a 9, wins a matchup. Some leagues do, if you win 5 out of the 9, your record is 5, and then the 4 you lost. Some leagues is just a 1-0 record. But my favorite way to go about it personally is the guard route. It makes it easier to monopolize the 5 out of the 9 categories, I think, because the guards are more dominant in points, assists, steals, threes, and free throw percentage. They're going to turn it over more, probably less field goal percentage efficiency as the bigs, blocks, of course, and rebounds. But I think that those 5 have more continuity with the guards, so I prefer to go guards. And it's easier to find guards that can also give 5 to 6 boards or more in kind of that category that you might be punting than it is to find the bigs that can have, 3 to 4 more assists, right? So you can kind of monopolize 5 categories not only, but also you could kind of get some nice little sprinkle of the other categories in there with some good guards like a James Harden or a Luka or people like that can get you some high rebounds and maybe win that category against another team that's not trying to go for rebounds. The case for the bigs, I mean, if you can get a Giannis and a Jokic or a Jokic, those are the rare bigs that, can give you really good assist numbers, like the 6+ assists. And, they can give you maybe less turnovers or really good defensive stats like steals. So in the end, I think no matter how you cut it, the sway category, right, the pivot category is probably points, right? This is probably the most competitive category week in and week out. If your team is not winning points or even close, you most likely aren't competitive enough elsewhere. So, I mean, if your guys aren't scoring points, they're probably not high enough usage. So I wouldn't just say, oh, I'm not going to try to go for points in this. I'm going to get a little weird with it, not going to try to go for points. If you're not going for points and you're saying, I don't need a guy that's going to score, that most likely means you have guys that aren't going to be high usage or less involved, which just means in general they're not going to be producing high enough stats elsewhere. So I think points is the good pivot point for both guards and bigs. So if you can get enough bigs that are really high scoring bigs like Joel Embiid or Jokic or Giannis or maybe a healthy Anthony Davis, I think that's kind of the swing category to look out for later in the drafts, mid drafts. But personally, I like to go guards because those 5 categories I think have better glue and continuity amongst the guards versus the other 4 for the bigs.
Definitely. And next tip here, I want to talk about the percentage categories. So the field goal percentage and the free throw percentage. And I want to really hammer down. This is going to sound like an obvious tip, but the first few players are going to be the highest usage guys on your team for, those categories specifically. And they have a larger impact on your field goal and free throw percentage than the guys later in the draft. So just so people understand, I know a lot of newer players to category leagues don't have that in their mind as much in the draft, and they look at field goal and free throw percentage as an individual player's percentage versus the overall total they contribute to your team's total percentage. So, for example, a guy like Giannis is going to get to the line, maybe, he's going to shoot 9 free throws a game, and his overall total, maybe he shoots 5 for 9 or 6 for 9. That impact, he's going to impact your overall free throw percentage way more than a lower usage guard later in a draft. Like I don't know, maybe a Trey Man or something, some guard that you would take later in the draft who's only going to get maybe 1 trip a game to the line. And, even if they shoot 2 for 2, it's not going to impact your overall field goal free throw percentage as much as a Giannis who's going to, get a ton of trips to the line. So I think the important tip when thinking about that is you can't really save your free throw percentage. So it is kind of a popular punt category, especially when you take a guy like Giannis. Luka's another guy who's kind of struggled from the free throw line lately. So it's a popular punt strategy to punt free throw percentage. But I want to reiterate, it's not really a category that you can necessarily save later in the draft. So don't think, hey, I took Giannis early, I'm struggling at free throw percentage, but hey, I can save it later in the draft in the late rounds by taking guys who are shooting 90% from the line consistently, because that 90% isn't going to impact your total free throw percentage bucket as much as your bigs who get to the line a decent amount, like a Giannis who's, been struggling from the line, compared to other players in the league. Because you're going to play against guys who took high usage guards earlier on who are really good from the free throw line, maybe like a James Harden or a Kevin Durant, who are going to get the trips on top of, shooting a high clip from the line. So don't think you can save something like a free throw percentage later, because the impact is a little bit different, right? It's not a total amount, but it is a total amount because it's the total, free throw makes with your free throw attempts for your entire team.
Yeah, it's a percentage over a total, right? So it's not less how many are made, it's what's the percent, what's the clip, right? So last one here we've got is, taking value in these 9-cat formats. So if you're in the 5th or 6th round and there's a guy that you really like, but you're like, I'm not going for this category, but he falls to you, you still should take him. You should take value. You should take best player available if he's there. I don't care if he fits or doesn't. You can still benefit from players dropping in these formats, even if they do not fit your tactic in the draft. Other people are punting categories as well, right? So taking the best player available, that can still win you a week. If you come up against someone that's kind of matching the kind of categories that you want to win as well, that player that you took there, that's good value, that might be high usage but didn't fit, you didn't think fit, he can win you that week just off sheer usage and ability to play the game. So, and on top of that, it's a trade asset, right? So there are other teams that have passed on him, and maybe you just like a Jaylen Brown fell into your lap late in the 5th round, for an example. If someone else needs, points or maybe rebounds, threes, maybe some steals, I guess, you can trade them later on and get some better value off of that pick. So just because, you don't need someone that fell to you, don't just like skip them off and search and scroll and select by a certain category that you need. Take that value. It's the same as any other fantasy draft that there is. Value is still value.
100% too. And kind of alongside a little bit of that, while maybe your first couple of picks are going to impact your overall draft strategy and which categories you're going to punt, you also kind of want to look at what other teams are building. And, after the first couple rounds, you probably have a good feel for the kind of players that the other league mates are going to target. And, maybe you shift your strategy a little bit and you notice, hey, looks like a lot of guys are reaching a little bit in certain categories. And, maybe you can, find a way to work around that. And you're going to get greater values in the categories that these guys are punting because those players are going to fall. Those people are going to ignore certain players are going to fall a little bit later. Just something to keep in mind. And just some kind of quick personal tips, as we're kind of closing out here. I think the defensive stat categories are something that are interesting. There's really only a few for blocks specifically, really high impact block players. So, you're talking about an Anthony Davis or, a Jaren Jackson Jr., a Rudy Gobert, guys that are just going to, consistently give you good block numbers. And I think that the defensive stat categories are tough ones to really focus on, in my opinion, because those impact players are few and far in between. So this mad scramble in reaching for these guys, I think can kind of hurt your overall team build when you're so focused on a stat that, if we're going to be completely honest, is a little more random than the other stats. You can kind of look at the other stats across the board, points, rebounds, assists, a little more consistent than players being able to get you, a block or two night in and night out. It's kind of tougher to quantify on those individual matchups. So personally, it's something that I ignore a little bit, and it's more of a deciding factor between two players than it necessarily is something I'm focusing on in a draft.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, right, most of these categories are usage-based, right? Points, rebounds, assists, threes, even turnovers. It's all about usage and getting people out there that are going to be involved in the offense, and steals and blocks isn't really usage, right? It's defense. So that is a lot more, unpredictable, I guess.
Definitely. Well, let us know if there's any category tips, we missed out here. Let us know in the comments. Would love to see those, and we'll see you in the next one.